So today, my name is Bernie Voss. I'm a talent solutions consultant at Pinsight, and Martin Lanik, the CEO, is here joining us today to tell us a little bit more about developing leadership competencies through habit development.
Good morning.
We've worked with several major companies like Coca-Cola, Denver Health, T-Mobile, Ruby Tuesdays, and Kia. We've been recognized by our peers with awards like the Gold Award from Chief Learning Officer Learning and Practice Award. Brandon Hall Group also recognized us with Silver in Excellence in Learning for use of learning in games and simulations. So today we'll be talking about combining micro-behaviors to develop leadership habits, fostering a domino effect or a keystone habit, and how to know when a skill is turned into a habit. So we're going to kick off today with a few polls. So what percentage of companies are dedicating more time to leadership development next year? We've got 8%, 24%, and 85%.
So if you can, on the call, so if you can take your guess, so what do you think, what percentage of companies are dedicating more time to leadership development this year? And we're seeing people voting. Maybe just a few more seconds, and then we can close the poll.
All right. And it looks like most people said 24%. 57% of people said 24%. In fact, according to the Brandon Hall Group, there's actually 85% of companies will be investing more time in leadership development next year.
So that's a significant investment, and I think all of us in learning and development are very pleased to see that organizations are now recognizing the value of leadership development, and they're investing much more into developing their leaders than they had before. So it's a very, very positive news, Bernie. Can we actually show the poll results? Yeah, here we go. Very good. Thank you.
All right, we've got another poll here. So, Martin, how much do you think companies spend on leadership development per leader per year?
Well, I think I know the answer, so I'm not going to reveal it before we let people actually vote on this. So that's a very interesting piece of research here that's coming from Versin by Deloitte. And of course, there are different numbers that organizations spend into developing a single leader as opposed to a high potential leader. But now we're just asking, in general, the average leader, how much organizations spend on developing a single leader in a year? Wow, so this seems to be pretty very evenly split. Okay, not anymore. Maybe just a few more seconds to allow you to vote. Okay, I think we're getting a winner here.
It's close. I think we might have one more person who might vote.
All right, so let's close it and let's see what the results are. So this is very interesting. You know, as I travel around the world, when I do client events, I always ask this question, and you see some fascinating differences around the world where, just what frame of reference people have of how much their organizations are spending on leadership development. And, here we're seeing that in Denver, and no, actually we have participants from all around the U.S. here on this webinar, but so the number tends to be 2,000 that people chose most often, and actually the correct answer is 4,000, right, Bernie? Do I remember correctly?
Wow, yes, that's correct. Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, so $4,000. $4,000 is the average spending on developing a single leader in a year. Now, organizations tend to spend much more on a high potential employee. Any guesses, Bernie, how much that number is?
Oh,
for
well,
a high
I would
potential
guess
employee.
I would double that. Go with 8,000.
Yeah, we're very close. So it's actually $7,611. So that's how much organizations spend on average in developing a high potential employee.
Very good. Well, we've got one more question here. So, Martin, if everyone wouldn't mind just throwing in a percentage guess here in the chat, we'll go ahead and read some of these responses off. So what % of employees say they actually apply skills learned in training on the job? So how many employees feel like their skills transfer from training to the job? You go ahead and type a response in the chat.
And maybe if we show the slide, it'll be easy to see what the question actually is. So we're asking what percentage of employees say that they actually apply skills learned in training on the job. And if you wouldn't mind just typing either in the questions button or option or in the chat function, so that way we can read some of these guesses off. So Karen here says 75%. Wow, Karen, that's very optimistic. We'll just give others a couple minutes. Sharon says 25%. Yeah, I think we're getting closer. Beth says 15%. We have John here, 28%. Okay. So what is it? What percentage of employees say that they actually apply skills learned in training on the job?
12%.
Well, this is a very low number, Bernie.
12%. That's correct, yes. So Beth was very, very close, and so was Sarah.
Good guesses.
So only 12, yes. So only 12% of employees say they actually apply skills learned on the job. That's alarmingly low. But given the fundamental issue here, the problem is that skills can't be taught through training, and skills are what's leading to development. So why do so many research studies suggest leadership development isn't worth it? Low ROI or a waste of time? There could be and probably are many reasons, but I'll propose one reason commonly overlooked that relates to this very topic, the difference between training and development, as I was hinting at a moment ago. So development focuses on new skill acquisition, whereas training focuses on knowledge acquisition. Knowledge isn't always applied directly on the job. There are some instances, but for the most part, when people implement a training, they usually want to develop some skills in their employees. Pinsight Philosophy is that leadership is actually a set of habits. So over the years, leadership theory has changed substantially. Originally, the focus was on characteristic great man theories that argue that there are certain characteristics great leaders have that make them effective. Researchers quickly discovered that there's more to the story than just characteristics. Characteristics matter, but that's not enough. People with the same characteristics may behave differently in different situations. So the focus turned to understanding which behaviors make leaders effective. This early research oversimplified things, focusing on two main groups of behaviors, and as a result of this, the approach was quickly replaced. Modern leadership scientists understand that there's some interplay between the person and her behaviors that determine great leadership. Although personality traits determine the leader's preferred style, the way we think about leadership now is based off of tangible behaviors and actions, often called competencies. This notion is especially important for the field of leadership development because unlike traits, leaders can develop competencies. Pinsight's philosophy on leadership is similar to many of the modern leadership theories in that while we recognize there's interplay between a person's disposition or personality and their behaviors are the most important component. We believe it's important to focus on things we can change and work on, the behavioral component. I introduced this now to set the context for the webinar and our approach, but also to help provide clarity in understanding the crucial distinction between development and training. So, Martin, what's the importance of habits? Why not skills?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first, I think you established and described very nicely that we think of leadership as a set of behaviors, and this is very important. So we know it's not a personality that makes a good leader. So basically, what we're saying is that leaders are not born; they're really made. And this is very important for us professionals in leadership development, because that suggests that we can actually now change leadership behaviors. We can teach people behaviors. We don't have any control over their personality. Research shows that, on average, it would take a person 10 years if we were trying to change their personality. But these behaviors, we can actually teach them. So that's very, very important. And, as you pointed out, so if we start thinking of leadership as really in terms of behaviors or competencies, then we can push that thinking a bit further and say, well, why don't we focus on developing leader habits? And you can see on this graph the difference between proficiency, skill, and then habit. And where they differ is the ease of displaying that behavior, and then also effectiveness of that behavior. So you see that on the top we have habits, and what makes habits very different from skills, back to your question, Bernie, is that habits are automatic, which means that we do them completely effortlessly. We don't even have to think about them. We just do them in response to certain cues, as we'll discover later on in this webinar. So this is very important because it frees up cognitive resources. So, we have a limited set of cognitive resources as human beings, and being able to free up some of these resources for leaders is very important, because then they can focus on what's important, and they can focus on other things rather than the leadership competency. So let me give you an example of what automaticity really is, or when a behavior or skill becomes actually automatic. So think about when you learn how to drive a car. So first, when you started developing this skill, you had to focus on every single micro behavior. So you had to focus on the steering wheel, on the gas pedal, the brake, clutch, shifting gears, turn signals. So all of this, when you think about it, driving a vehicle is a very complex behavior. But what we can do is break it down into these different micro actions. And, altogether, it probably took you 2-3 months. And then all these micro actions are now working, or micro behaviors are working together, and to a point where you don't even think about it. So your ability or skill to drive a vehicle became automatic. And so now you can talk on the phone, or you could even text, which you shouldn't be, but you have the cognitive resources to focus on something else. So you don't have to be focused on thinking about every single micro behavior for driving a vehicle. So when you compare it to a skill, so a skill is something that is still deliberately displayed. So we can define a skill as a deliberate display of behavior. And the difference then with habits is that, when it's deliberate, you still have to think about it. It requires conscious thought, versus a habit is something that is completely automatic, and it doesn't require, any thinking whatsoever.
So a new driver.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so a new driver learning to drive a car is similar to a new leader, in the sense that, eventually with practice, they really could become an effective leader the same way that eventually people become an effective driver.
Yes, absolutely, and that's really what today's webinar is about. When you think about how much time you've devoted to learning how to drive, you didn't spend a whole week or maybe a couple days in a training or workshop, but you practice a little bit every day, and that's how you learn how to drive. So that's the whole point of today's webinar. Mm-hmm. To answer, very short answer to your question, why habits rather than skills? Because once we turn a competency, a leadership competency, into habit, it's automatic. It means the person does it, the leader does it without conscious thought, and it frees out these cognitive resources so they can actually think, or they can be doing something else. They are not devoting all of their cognitive resources on this particular competency. So that's why we want to make that behavior automatic.
That makes a lot of sense.
So it can go. Yeah, we talked about combining these micro behaviors. So I want to propose now a very important concept that the rest of this webinar is based on. So when we think of a leadership competency, things like strategic thinking or business acumen, or influencing others, delegating, empowering employees. So these are all leadership competencies that you would probably find in every organization's competency model. But when you think about it, every single leadership competency is a complex behavior. So that means that that behavior consists of multiple micro behaviors or micro actions. So we can actually take that competency and we can break it down into individual components. And this is very, very important, because teaching leaders the whole competency at once is ineffective. They won't be able to adopt those behaviors, and it's even very difficult to practice. So it's not an effective approach to teach leaders the whole competency at once. Rather, what we have to do is break it down into the different micro behaviors. And this concept, by the way, in behavioral psychology is called chaining. So this is what animal training is based on. So if you ever trained a dog, you trained a cat or a horse or whatever animal on any complex behavior, you always start with you always break down that complex behavior into smaller pieces, let's call them micro behaviors, and then you teach the animal one behavior at a time, and then you start putting those complex behaviors together. So this is a concept that has been very well documented since like 1950s, and it's called chaining, again, for those of you who are into psychology. This is so we know that it works with animal training, but when you really think about it, we use this concept of chaining to also train athletes. So if you were trained in any sort of sport, you followed, and the way you adopted that sport and became better at that sport is through this concept of chaining. Or if you're playing a musical instrument, same thing. When I started college, I was majoring in piano performance, and I can think back about how I was taught how to play the piano. So it was actual practice sessions, but it was you took the whole new piece that I was supposed to play a composition, and then you start breaking it down into smaller chunks. And then you even practice the right hand first and then the left hand first, and then you start putting it together once you mastered each piece separately. So this is a concept of chaining that we know works really well. We use it in sports education, musical education. So anytime we are trying to teach people a new set of skills, we know better, and we actually break down the skills into individual components. The interesting part is that somehow we've overlooked this in leadership development, and we focus on the entire competency at once, and that's why we are seeing such a low return on investment in leadership development. So at Pinsight, we have actually done the research to identify what are these micro behaviors for the most common competencies. So when you take, I'll walk you through an example here. So when you take a competency like delegating well, for instance, so this is a very complex behavior. If we define it as assigning complete projects that have a clear beginning and end and fit the employee's skill and interest, this is a very complex set of behaviors. But what we can do is break down delegation as a process through, and we can identify the individual behaviors that actually that effective leaders do when they delegate. And you can see it here on the slide right here. So this is coming from our research at Pinsight of thousands of leaders who we observed in a simulation, a standardized simulation. And we've then started analyzing the different behaviors And we broke down these complex behaviors into, the micro behaviors that I mentioned before. So what does it look like to delegate well? So we've identified that leaders who delegate well, they follow these four or do these four micro behaviors. So first they identify what and let the employee figure out how to do it. So they give the assignments with the end goal in mind, but let the employee figure out how to actually get there. So that's one micro behavior. The other one, they have a discussion, or they think about whether this project or task actually fits with the employee's current skill level. So that is one portion of it, or another micro behavior. Then they also consider the employee's interests. So they're not just delegating the project or tasks to anyone. They actually think about, well, is this person going to be interested? Are they going to enjoy what I'm about to assign to them? And then, from a kind of tracking perspective, they agree on deliverables and deadlines. So there is a clear understanding of what the expectations are in terms of what the employee is going to deliver and at what point. So these are the four micro behaviors that make up delegating well. And once we have this leadership competency broken down into these micro behaviors, then we can start focusing and building exercises that actually turn into habits, or that help leaders to take these behaviors and actually turn them into habits. So for those of you who have read The Power of Habit, a wonderful book that I recommend highly, by the way, so it was I believe a New York Times bestseller, so very, very influential book. I think everybody in training and development should read it because it really does a great job describing this habit building formula, and all of the research summarizes nicely the research that we found in neuroscience and cognitive and behavioral psychology. So how do people form habits in general? There are three components to this. The first one is a cue. So this means that somehow that behavior needs to be triggered. There needs to be some kind of a reminder that is going to trigger or remind the person to actually do the behavior. And some of these cues could be artificial. So these are cues that you actually create yourself, such as a reminder in your phone or in your calendar. To do the behavior, maybe a sticky note on your desk or cubicle. So these are cues that are artificial. And they work pretty well. They remind us to practice the behavior. But ultimately what we want are natural cues. So natural cues are cues that occur organically in the environment. So they occur naturally. And these are very good because then they naturally trigger the behavior as well. So when you think about a right cue for a particular habit, what's important is to think about a chain of behaviors. So when would be the behavior appropriate to display? After you do what? So let me give you an example. So for instance, you could, after you open your calendar to check where your meeting is, you could review the meeting agenda. Right? Do you see how that cue is now natural? So it's naturally occurring. You naturally check your phone or your calendar multiple times a day to see where your next meeting is, and you can use this cue then to remind or to remember to check the agenda. So these are the cues. So that's the first step in the habit building formula. Then we have the behavior, of course, and this is the action that we want the person to perform. So this is where the micro behaviors come into play that I talked about earlier. So once you break down the competency into individual micro behaviors, the micro behaviors come into play here once after you identify the cue. So we'll spend more time talking about these behaviors, so I'll skip that and then go straight to the reward. So of course you need to have that behavior rewarded somehow, and there are two types of rewards. Again, there are intrinsic, extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards are things like a piece of chocolate, or maybe you tell yourself good job, or whatever works for you as a reward. And then the intrinsic reward, that's what you really want. So intrinsic reward is something that is naturally rewarding, so comes naturally again to you. And we find that competencies are actually tied to different personality traits, and that's how you achieve that intrinsic reward. So you achieve intrinsic rewards by doing things that are natural for you. So example, extroversion, introversion, and public speaking. So if you're extrovert, learning how to be a great public speaker is going to be much more natural, much easier than if you're introverted. And that's how you get at that intrinsic reward, doing things that come naturally to you because they're easier and they are rewarding in and of themselves. Good, so we talked about practice. So once you have identified a cue, you've identified a behavior, you've identified the right reward, then you start the practice process. And practice really does make better. We'll touch back on the research of, how long do you need to practice and how do you know if you're practicing the right things. But the key is to, again, break down that complex leadership competency into individual components, identify a cue for each micro behavior, and a reward, and then just practice that cycle over again. We get this naturally with, musical instruments, sports, with, any kind of habits that we're trying to build. It's through this repetition. So let me give you some concrete examples of what this leader habit development actually could look like. So here's an example of a natural cue. So when discussing a project task with an employee, that's the cue, ask for agreement on deliverables from the employee, and that's the micro behavior. Okay, so this is one very simple 5-minute-a-day exercise, and that if you practice this multiple times, the research shows 66 days. For most people, it's going to turn into a habit. So again, we have very solid cue when discussing a project or a task with an employee, and then the micro behavior asking for agreement on deliverables from the employee. So here's another example. Oftentimes I hear from clients, well, this works great for some simple competencies, but can you even develop very complex senior executive type of competencies like strategic thinking? And the answer is yes, because the process is still the same. This is how people in general develop habits. So here's an example of taking strategic perspective. So a very natural cue after you start your computer each morning. And then, so this is something, again, that would happen regularly every day. And then the behavior, spend 5 minutes to explore part of your organization or industry you know little about. So it's a very concrete behavior that you're pairing with this cue. And what this behavior will do is just every day expand the perspective of this individual. Why is this important from a strategic standpoint? Because part of what it means to be strategic is having very broad perspective. So this is, again, one of the micro behaviors that we've identified through our research that effective strategic thinkers do. So they do have that broad perspective inside and outside of the organization. And how do you get there? Well, you get there through this habit building process where you are pairing a cue with a specific behavior. So you can take any competency, really any competency, no matter how complex it is, and then break it down into these micro behaviors, identify a naturally occurring cue, and then through the pairing process, you can actually be developing habits. All right, so this is a graph here that became very famous in this habit building literature, and it was developed by B.J. Fogg, who is a researcher at Stanford University. And what he argued and what he found actually is that the harder something it is to do, the more motivation you need to actually do that. And said differently, if something is very difficult to do, you need a lot of motivation, and therefore you're more likely to end in failure as opposed to success. So when you think about this, it has direct impact on this concept of 5 minutes a day. Because if you are trying to develop a full leadership competency, like delegating well, right? We know that it consists of 4 micro behaviors. But if, let's say that we are trying to develop this whole competency at once, it's very difficult to do. So it's going to be on the left side of this graph right here. And as a result, it also requires very, very high motivation because it's so hard to do. The person needs to be very, very, very motivated to actually do this. And we know that our motivation fluctuates on a daily basis. So maybe you are a morning person, so you're going to be very motivated, very energetic in the morning. Maybe you are a night owl, so your energy and your motivation really happens in the evening or at night. But the point is that it fluctuates, throughout the day, and then even day to day. You'll see people have different levels of motivation. So if you keep the behavior really hard, there will be days where your motivation is low, and then it's very difficult for you to do this. And you won't do it. You won't do the practice. So if we keep that micro behavior, if we keep that exercise very small, let's say 5 minutes a day, that's all we're asking you to do. Even on the days when your motivation is the lowest, you are still more likely to do that behavior and to do your practice because it doesn't require a lot of effort. It's easy to do. So it's much more likely a simple behavior, practicing a micro behavior that takes 5 minutes a day, it will cross that success-failure line is much more likely to cross that success-failure line. And as a result, you are more likely to turn that micro behavior into a habit. So that's why keep in mind, the simpler you keep the practice, the better, because even on days when your motivation is really low, you'll still have enough energy to do the practice. Good. So we're moving into the second agenda item here, and that is, so we talked about micro behaviors and the importance of keeping it very simple, but now, can you really start a domino effect? Or is it always just practicing one behavior and then the next micro behavior and next micro behavior and putting it together? Or is there a more efficient way to do this? Is there a more efficient way to start practicing something that actually moves into, propels you forward and starts this domino effect? And there is. So it's called a keystone habit. So this is the one habit that if you do, it's going to start a whole chain of behaviors. So in the health literature, it's usually things like quitting smoking. That has the potential to start a whole chain, a whole domino effect of other habits. So people who quit smoking usually start eating better, they start exercising because they have more energy. So this is, and as a result, their whole life changes, so their lifestyle changes. So this keystone habit, finding that keystone habit has the potential to propel you forward and speed up your development. And that's what we want, because if we find that keystone habit, and the person is going to be developing at an exponential rate, and it's going to be developing much, much faster than just practicing one behavior at a time. However, it's not that easy to find these keystone habits. They are quite tricky. So there are a couple things that you need to be aware of when you're finding a keystone habit. And that is finding or triggering that behavior in multiple ways. So the way you can get at keystone habits is finding a cue that occurs in multiple environments, right? So if your cue is, opening your computer, or after you open your computer, you learn something new about the organization or your industry. So if that's the habit you're trying to develop, and for it to turn into a keystone habit, you actually have to be practicing it in different environments so that you are strengthening the cue. So for instance, practice it on the airplane, in your home office, in your office, at work, if you're in your hotel room. So the more environments that you have, the stronger the associations will be, and the more likely you are to trigger those behaviors. So practice across multiple contexts or multiple environments is very, very important here. And Bernie, I think we have a poll at this stage.
Yes, we do. I'll go ahead and throw that up.
Okay.
So in this is basically just a little quiz here. Can you see this? It says, which habit has more potential to be a keystone habit and produce a domino effect? Maintaining eye contact or shaking hands?
Yeah, I'm launching it now. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So imagine Charlie trying to develop his social skills. Which one of these habits do you think has more potential to be a keystone habit and produce a domino effect? Keep it open for about 5 more seconds.
Oh, wow, there's a clear winner here.
Absolutely. Looks like most people have responded, and that's actually correct. So maintaining eye contact is essential to virtually all social situations and can lead to scores of other social habits, including shaking hands, for example. Shaking hands is an important social skill, but it's nowhere near as fundamental as holding eye contact. Maintaining eye contact applies to situations where you're listening to others as well as talking to them. You can have a conversation without a handshake, but it's very difficult to have one at all without eye contact.
Good.
And that looks like most of you...
Go ahead.
I was just saying, so it looks like most people agree and see where understand this keystone habit principle here. So Martin, when do you move on to the next habit? How do you know it's time to start developing another habit? If this is a keystone habit or not, when do you know when you should start consciously trying to work on another habit?
Right. So that's a very good question. At what point do you know? So you start your practice, you're pairing your cue with the behavior. How do you know that you've actually that the skill actually turned into a habit, and that you do something automatically? There are few ways to know, and if we can go to the next slide, I'll actually outline what those different ways are. Good, here we go. So the first thing to note is that on average, so the average person, average habit, right? Because some things are going to take us longer to turn into a habit than others. But the average of practice is 66 days that researchers have found. So no matter what the habit is, it should take on average 66 days of practice. So that's the first rule of thumb. So you know when it's time to move on to the next habit or the next competency when you practice something for 66 days. So that's one way to know. The other way is that it actually is integrated into your routine. So that means that at least once per day you are performing this micro behavior after a regular event or something, some cue that has naturally occurred during the day. Example here, after you swing your feet out of bed, you slip on your running shoes as part of your routine for getting up. And that will force you to go out actually and do the running. So when you're noticing that it has become a natural part of your daily routine or your work routine, you know that you've got a habit here. The next one is that it's quick, right? So this means that that you are performing the target behavior more and more quickly. So it takes you less time to actually do this behavior. And that is example here. So if you truly developed a habit that you'll begin to start doing before you even realize that you are actually doing it. It just occurs so quickly. And that gets at the point of automaticity as well, and that's the last point. So when you are noticing that you don't even think about it, or you realize that you did a behavior afterwards, so after it has actually occurred, that's an example on another way to know that this skill has actually turned into a habit. So, you know, I think about it when you driving, for instance, when you miss your exit, right? You get so wrapped up in the conversation and driving on the highway that you actually miss your exit. So you know that driving is a habit because you've done it automatically without even thinking about it. And in fact, you were focusing on something completely different.
Wow. So to make this more concrete and provide a real example of how this can be implemented within the context of leadership development, I'll talk a little bit about how our approach might work this way. So participants in a simulation are immersed in a totally fictitious organization, and they interact with real life role players, and basically it's like a day in the life assessment of how they might perform a job. But this provides a lot of rich feedback. So we can actually see exactly the behaviors that they were doing and in the situations that they were doing, that they performed them in. So which situations do people need to improve certain behaviors? So if it's a habit, it's going to be occurring across situations, right? So after a simulation, they can get detailed feedback on the behaviors they performed or didn't perform in different situations. And so a good application for the leadership habits would be to, you know, provide feedback on which behaviors that micro behaviors should be practiced. So for example, here we have the micro behaviors here on the left, and then the overall competency over here, mentor and coach. And then once we identify those behaviors, we can provide specific, you know, 5-minute-a-day examples of how people can work on developing these habits. So coming next for Pinsight, we're actually going to be working on prescriptive habits for leaders that are directly tied to the simulation results. And there'll be daily reminders and a system for tracking progress and improvement in order to establish these new habits that will lead to actual leadership development. So in conclusion, basically what we'd like you to take away is leadership competencies are basically composed of several micro behaviors that you can turn into habits. Hopefully you can establish that some of these habits will be helping you develop other good habits and cause a domino effect. And ultimately, we want to build a whole bunch of these positive leadership habits. And that should be your goal for leadership development.
So this is, thank you for that. Yeah, so before we get into questions, I think, you know, what's really important, if we can go to the next slide, yeah. So this is, if you remember nothing else from today's webinar, so this is the key takeaway message, that leadership competency, you know, when you think about it, it is really a set of micro behaviors. And if we take inspiration from the way we are teaching people sports, or we're teaching them musical instruments, you know, any type of skill that consists of micro behaviors, there's only so much we can do in a classroom. So what they have to do, they actually have to practice those sports, or they have to practice playing those musical instruments. And that's very, very important for us to realize as leadership development professionals, because we need to be able to design our development in a way that truly focuses on acquisition of skills and a practice of these behaviors. So the way to do it is to break down that big leadership competency into micro behaviors, and then design very basic 5 minutes a day type of exercises that leaders can do on a daily basis. So Bernie shared with you here an example of what that 5 minutes a day type of exercise would look like. And that's very good way, and very inexpensive way when you think about it, to actually develop leadership skills, and more importantly then develop leadership habits. Good. So we can go to questions.
Okay. So if you'd like to type your questions in the chat.
If you do have any questions, please type them in the chat. We have about 12 minutes.
Okay. All right, here's one. Do 360 feedback ratings work the same way as the simulation example you provided because there are different people rating in different contexts?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that this is related to the habits. And essentially, so when you adopt this philosophy that leadership development is really about building positive leadership habits, then you need to use an assessment that actually follows that logic as well. So you need a behavioral assessment. You know, the difference with a 360, so what you are picking up is more of a reputation. So what's the reputation of the person in the organization, which is important, especially the higher up the person gets in the organization. But what a simulation type of assessment give you is very specific observations of skills in a standardized type of environment. So the importance of that is you are able to actually show the consistency of the behavior across different situations, and you have trained raters that are making the observations. So you can give very specific feedback to leaders that, hey, you know, not only is is this competency, like delegating well, a proficiency of yours, and these are the two micro behaviors that you actually need to turn into habits for it to move to a strength and to turn this into a habit.
Okay. So, Martin, earlier in the presentation, you mentioned, you know, matching intrinsic motivation with personality and the different habits you might be trying to form. So, how does this relate to how you can tell if a competency is natural or not?
Yeah, that's another very good question. I'm glad to see that people are listening to our webinar here. So to tell whether competency is coming naturally to you or not, and you can do by measuring the personality of the individual. So we tend to use, and most personality researchers would agree that the Big Five factor model of personality is the one that is most accepted these days. And most of the assessments, personality assessments that you might use actually follow the Big Five factor model. And then you can map the different competencies you use in your organization to those personality factors. So for instance, the easiest example to understand probably would be extroversion, introversion, and public speaking. Right? So for extroverts, public speaking is going to come more naturally than for introverts. So it's really measuring personality.
Yeah, that makes sense. Looking for more questions. I see that we have a comment. Right,
yeah, and we got a comment here from Amy. Thanks, this was very good and practical session. I see many uses and applications for this. We'll start using right away in training and in coaching. Thank you. You're very welcome, Amy. So maybe we can do one more question, Bernie, and then we can close.
Absolutely. So, how about this one? Looks like somebody's been using an in-person assessment center, and how ours is delivered. What's the benefit for leadership habit formation for simulation instead of in-person assessment centers?
Right. Yeah. So that's I get that question quite a bit. So you know, for those of you who are familiar with assessment centers, so this is kind of the high-touch executive assessment, the day in the life assessment, where you send the executive to an office, and then for a full day they are role-playing, and they have psychologists observing them, and so forth. So this is the kind of the flagship assessment that's available to us as HROD professionals. So what we've seen in the past 10 years or so is that these in-person assessment centers have been moving online more and more so. And that's what we do at Pinsight. What we specialize in is the virtual assessment centers. So you take this model of of a very high-touch, day-in-the-life type of immersive simulation with live human role plays, and you move it online. And the benefit of doing that, Bernie, to your point, is that they're great cost savings. So what used to cost $10,000, $15,000 for an in-person assessment center, now when you cut out the travel costs, you streamline it, the processes, you move it online, we've been able to achieve 80% cost reduction. So so that's the benefit of using a virtual assessment center as opposed to an in-person one. So it's really the ROI. The quality, our research shows that there is not much difference between the in-person and the virtual assessment center in terms of results, but by doing it online, you are saving costs, and you are able to scale this process globally because now it's delivered through the internet.
So these leadership habits can be developed. So these leadership habits can be developed either way, but you just get a lot larger ROI from the simulation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So as long as you're using behavioral observation as the method, then you're getting at these, you're measuring these leadership habits and kind of where the person is today, and based on that information, you can help them create a development plan.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that'll about wrap it up for Can You Really Develop Leadership Competencies in 5 minutes a day? Anybody has any last minute questions, you can shoot them out now, or we appreciate you attending today, and we'll be sending out your HRIC credits shortly. Thank you.
Great. So if you have any questions or you'd like to have more information, you see our email addresses here, so don't hesitate to reach out. And then also we do have a webinar, we do have a survey after this webinar. It's about 3 questions, so it helps us to make these webinars more useful and more helpful for you. So if you would take the time to fill it out, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.